It is truly a joy to be here with you today. I do not know how to follow a complete worship service like that. By definition, the main work of the morning has been done. However, I was asked to give a talk, so here I am. And you're still here, most of you. I see your bags in the corner. If people start rolling their bags out, I'll know that I've gone too long. I am grateful to be with you. I believe this is my first opportunity to be at a Q conference, and I feel honored to be here with you. There was a text read from the Psalms earlier that my preacher, Julie Pennington Russell, used to always start off her messages with, and I'll start off mine. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts together in this place be pleasing in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Psalm 72, which is used in the lectionary traditions constantly in Advent, I noticed that this year, says this, give the king your justice, O God, and your righteousness. May he judge your people with righteousness and your poor with justice. May the mountains yield prosperity for the people and the hills in righteousness. May he defend the cause of the poor of the people, give deliverance to the needy, and crush the oppressor. May he live while the sun endures, and as long as the moon throughout all generations. And then in 11, may all kings fall down before him, all nations give him service. Listen to these two verses. For he delivers the needy when they call, the poor and those who have no helper. He has pity on the weak and the needy, and saves the lives of the needy. From oppression and violence he redeems their life, and precious is their blood in his sight. Part one of my 18-part address. I promise. No, it's not going to be that long. Part one I've called Governments and LGBTQ plus people. Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany on January 30th, 1933, on a platform of restoring German greatness, national unity, and economic recovery. He vowed to defeat Germany's enemies, both internal and external. A significant part of his campaign rhetoric was the promise of restoring traditional Germanic Christian values and moral order, with nods in the direction of a generic Germanic Christianity. In power, the Nazi regime enforced a substantial traditionalist program, including enforcement of old norms of masculinity and femininity, and a strongly anti-gay agenda that ultimately included concentration camps for gays and lesbians. This, of course, was in addition to the agenda that more people remember of anti-Semitism and racism. You know, my friends, national renewal movements, so-called, almost always gain their momentum by supposing both a vision of national unity and a list of enemies of national unity. Populist political mobilization usually involves defining some portion of the population as the true or real nation and proposing an aggressive revolt or attack of this real nation against the, you might call them, enemies of the people, the aliens, the interlopers, the threateningly different others. Triumph for the nation thus means defeat for the internal enemies of the nation. There's something very twisted about human collective psychology at this point. People may be attracted to a message of national unity in the abstract, but such a vision is more likely to gain passionate adherence and accelerating momentum if the populist leader can list a concrete set of enemies to defeat as an essential part of the fight for national greatness. You got to have an enemies list. This is why it is always very slow and very hard work to do something like build a human rights movement or a civil rights movement with a strategy based on creating a positive vision of the beloved community in which everyone is viewed with compassion and treated with justice and love, with dignity, and with a conscious effort not to attack enemies or opponents, but instead to cast a positive vision. It's much harder and slower to do this. Much easier to oppose such a movement with a strategy of attacking individuals and groups as enemies, communists, subversive, threats to the national or regional way of life. The recent election results in this nation and the longer-term pattern in many U.S. states can be interpreted in various ways. There's not just one thing going on. It's best not to oversimplify, but still. One thing that it does appear to mean is that not just dozens of state governments in our country, but now the United States government will now resist a vision of inclusion of all on equal terms as the true meaning of America and American values. The United States government will now be at best indifferent to, and in some cases actively hostile to, an active state commitment to civil rights and inclusion. That vision that has dominated the progressive imagination since at least the late 1950s. The United States government will no longer be focused on exercising its power to advance civil and political rights for all. Will no longer care about an environment of emotional and physical safety for LGBTQ plus people. I don't see evidence so far that the new regime in Washington is itching for full-scale government assault on all queer people, but I do see disturbing evidence that trans folks are already being targeted directly and particularly in a linguistic and policy strategy that can only be described as erasure. There are two other groups that are already directly in the crosshairs, potential targets of the crushing use and abuse of government power, and these are immigrant and refugee populations, both legal and undocumented, and political and legal adversaries of the new president. Did you notice that the enemies are already being named, and in some cases, Secret Service protection is being taken from them, at the same time that groups like the Proud Boys have been released and pardoned from prison? What do we think is going to happen? I should also note that women as a group cannot feel especially secure in a national environment in which a history of sexual predation no longer disqualifies people from the highest public offices in the land. This is a good moment to offer the sad observation that a significant chunk of the religious community, the Christian community, fully or almost fully embraced the Nazi traditional values campaign in Germany in the early 1930s. And a similarly large chunk in our country endorses the same traditional values campaign of the states and of the new federal government. It is by now very clear that traditional Christian populations who once held a national majority and do still hold many local and regional majorities, but in recent times have had to contend with an overall loss of social control, are ripe for the picking whenever populist politicians are building their national greatness campaigns. You can always mobilize the traditional Christians around make the country great / traditional again. Let's call this version of Christianity reactionary, authoritarian, majority culture Christianity. It has emerged in similar forms on several continents, beginning with Europe and many countries. The conditions have to be exactly right, but unfortunately the conditions are often exactly right in late modern, post-Christian, or on the way to post-Christian societies. What I'm talking about here is where you have formerly established majority Christian populations like the Russian Orthodox Church in Russia or the Catholic Church in Poland or the Anglican Church in the UK country, or Commonwealth countries, or evangelicals and Catholics here, who become frustrated and then worried and then absolutely panicked over their relative loss of power and population share in society, over the spread of populations that directly reject their values, over political decisions and legal judgments that enshrine policies that they reject, like abortion rights or gay rights, or inclusive immigration, or even racial desegregation in some cases. If a politician comes along at just the right moment and says, I stand with you, I will restore things to the way they used to be back when America was great, or Germany, or Russia, or Poland, or Hungary, or Brazil. I will overturn the changes you do not like. I alone can fix it. It is the most natural thing in the world for these reactionary Christian populations to be all about such leaders. So here the agenda of national greatness and Christian restoration merge and blend. The fine details of who suffers and what is done to them don't matter all that much because we're restoring national greatness. For me, when you think about this history, a passage like Psalm 72 is so prophetic / sad. The psalmist prays for a king who will deliver the needy when they call, the poor and those who have no helper, a king who has pity. Did you know there was a moment in this last week where somebody simply asked the new king for some pity? Remember that? From oppression and violence, he redeems their life, and precious is their blood in his sight. We're taught to pray for leaders like this in every country. When government actually does this, and we experience the concrete benefits, we have reason to be very grateful to them and to God. You know, as you look back on it now, especially under Democratic presidents in our country since Obama, this is how the United States government has ranged its power, has used its power in relation to LGBTQ plus people. Not always as much as they should have, but they've been friendly. Let me give you just a couple of examples. I was in Romania in 2013 on a speaking trip just after there had been an event there where in Bucharest they were having LGBT History Month, and they showed the movie The Kids Are All Right. Remember that movie? But this was so inflammatory to the right wing in Romania that a crowd of extremists and nationalists and neo-Nazis and church folks attacked the screening of the movie at the local museum in Bucharest. The crowd interrupted the film by singing the national anthem and waving flags. Protesters held crosses and religious icons. They took photos of themselves in front of the screen while holding up the national flag or a Nazi flag. And that had just happened when I was there, or just before I got there. And somehow, when I was there, a meeting was arranged between me and the foreign minister of Romania, because why not, right? Sure, dude, I'm around, you're around, let's talk, you know? So I remember being ushered into the Romanian foreign ministry in 2013, and I spent 45 minutes with this foreign minister. He's like their Secretary of State. And what he wanted to talk with me about was, why was the Obama administration putting so much pressure on the Romanian government to protect its LGBTQ population? Why were they saying that good relations between the U.S. and Romania depended on getting this right? Now that was interesting. So we spent 45 minutes doing that. Just last year, in the last stage of the Biden presidency, I was approached by the U.S. Embassy in, let's just call it a very anti-LGBTQ African country. So what was happening was the embassy was wanting to put together a program for their entire staff as to why the United States, for moral and religious reasons, was opposed to the anti-LGBT legislation that had passed, and why every member of that staff should think of it as a moral cause. Now, the logistics ultimately broke down, and they were concerned about any kind of religious talk in a U.S. government program. But the idea that the embassy of our country in this land was going to try to make a positive impact on behalf of the LGBTQ population there by training their staff, including local nationals, is another example of the United States government saying we will use our power to stand up for LGBTQ people. Well, friends, that era is for now over. It is over. Now, it is comforting when the power of the state swings around to our side to help us and the people that we love. But the changeability of government policy must never be forgotten. What one government gives, the next one can take away. If the government withdraws its active support for the rights and dignity and well-being of LGBTQ plus people, we do lose a powerful ally. And it may well have a trickle-down effect as well if bad actors feel more free to test the legal and moral limits of action against our community. In other words, if the state doesn't care, then maybe some people with a, you might say, itchy trigger finger might feel like they're empowered to do some things. This forces us to ask this fundamental question. If this is how it's going to be in this country, as it is in many other countries, if this is our new context, where shall we go for strength in such a time as this? I ask specifically about Christian LGBTQ plus people such as those gathered here. Especially given the reactionary turn of many of our fellow Christians, we know that we will not get any help from our fellow Christians on the right. If the government and the atmosphere turns against us, they're not going to say, oh, we better try to be helpful. And the older secular gay rights movement is likely to be in a defensive mode, trying to protect basic civil rights gains. I don't expect there'll be much energy for outreach or partnership with groups like this. So that leads to my second overall point. I want to suggest that this is the moment that we have been preparing for. The situation might look pretty dire overall, except for the fact that here we are together. Groups like Q Christian Fellowship and some sister organizations and the hundreds of congregations that are now truly and not just cosmetically inclusive, and the many nurturing online spaces have been developing for more than a decade. This is not a baby movement anymore. There is maturity here and wisdom and resources and experience and lessons learned. Now is the time when we will find out just what exactly we have built. Or dare we say it, what exactly God has built over this time. Now is the time when we will find out exactly how much social capital, as the sociologists say, has been accrued over these years. How much resilience, how much connection, how much solidarity, how much kinship, how much allyship, how much love for one another. Now is when we find out exactly how sturdy are the newly inclusive post-rejectionist churches that have been pioneered over these years. And by the way, one of the things I loved about this service today, this was like a Anglo-Episcopal Methodist type, service today, A Catholic, Anglo-Episcopal, Methodist, Presbyterian. This is a reminder that, the mainline churches, most of them have been moving towards inclusion long ahead of the evangelical churches. Anywhere we have friends, we need to look to build and strengthen those relationships. Now is when we find out whether the peace with God that we've been talking about, the liberative vision, the holistic gospel, the renewing winds of God's Spirit that we have felt here, whether it survives contact with a more hostile outside world, including a hostile state. More hostile than at any time since the current LGBTQ plus movement has been growing in the Christian world. In other words, in a hostile environment, are we ready? The very good news, I believe, is that with God's help, we are ready. What we do in spaces like this has never been dependent upon the blessings of the majority culture church, because that's a good thing, because they've never offered it, right? It has also never been dependent upon the support of the government. It's been helpful that we had a favorable political environment and that sometimes laws were moving in our direction, but the loss of that should not affect us, this community. As long as the state honors its constitutional obligations, constitutional obligations to respect freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of association, all we really need from the state is to honor the Constitution and leave us alone. But if the state should choose to oppress our community, not to leave us alone, to attack and not to respect our rights, well, then we will be in good company historically. We've been here before. And we will not cease to be who we are or do what we do. Even if driven underground, this movement will continue to proclaim the good news that God loves all people with all that they are, that all of God's children are beautiful and beloved, all are made in God's image, all are made for flourishing and not for dehumanization and oppression. There is no conceivable external force that can make a community like this renounce its core beliefs or refrain from advancing the commitments that have been clarified over these years, or refrain from sustaining a community that has been so laboriously built up over many years. 20 years ago, this was inconceivable. But now it is built for such a time as this. Looking again at the Nazi years, we have much evidence that can help us think ahead to worst-case scenarios and maybe a little bit less than worst case. We can anticipate, for example, that the reactionary majority church Christians will applaud all kinds of steps that could be taken to set back LGBTQ plus dignity and rights. In other words, if the state should try to roll back gay marriage, which it might, traditionalist Christians are not likely to say, oh, we really need to be sensitive about that because we care about our queer brothers and sisters. There is a direct line from the moral majority to this moment. I anticipate that many in the conservative sector of U.S. Christianity will press for an aggressive anti-queer line from the federal government, even more aggressive than what is currently being threatened. Pile on will be the idea. And bystanders who are not anti-queer zealots, but are frightened of the state and of its leader and of its most aggressive partners, for example, in online spaces, will do what bystanders do. They will try to stay low and get out of the way and not get negative attention. They will keep quiet. That is what bystanders do. This does not appear to be a time where many bystanders will become allies, because there's nothing in it for them, though God's Spirit blows as she wills. But those whose hearts and loyalties have already been transformed, whose churches and friendship networks and families have already been broken and remade, whose vision of God's faithful covenant love has already been broadened, we're going to just do what comes naturally. We already died to the old way of doing Christianity, and there's no going back. We're going to remain in community with each other. Could you imagine a situation where we would say, we better not meet because they might be mad at us? We will weep with those who weep. We will rejoice with those who rejoice. We will hang together. These will perhaps be hard times, but the witness of Christian history is that such times are some of our very best. All over Nazi Germany in 1933 and Nazi-controlled Europe after 1939, enemies of the state targeted by the regime, or who loved those who were being targeted, or who had an unshakable vision of a God who sides with the oppressed, they did what they knew they must do. They stood with their friends, their loved ones, and even strangers who were targeted. When advocacy was still possible in public, they did public advocacy. When that time ended and all there was civil disobedience, they did civil disobedience. When that time ended and all you could do was rescue people, they did rescue underground. They did what they sensed was needed at the moment. And eventually, though there were great losses, the storm passed. And those who stood with the oppressed and those who fought for one another are the ones that we honor today. So what do you do now? What do we do now? If we have meaningful opportunities to speak truth to the state, we do that. If we feel the need to bear local witness against local outbreaks of harassment, we do that. But to my fellow Christians in the room, I definitely say this: it is always the right time for us to be the church. Always the right time. That means if there are 99 safe sheep and one in danger, we care about all 100. To leave not one behind. To strengthen the bonds of Christian community, to proclaim the teachings of Jesus and the holistic gospel. To stand in solidarity with the oppressed. To endure rejection and hostility for Christ's sake and in his way. The good news of the gospel includes but goes beyond the very good news that all people are equal at the foot of the cross and all people are equally offered salvation. The moral demands of Jesus include but go beyond the very real demand that people of all genders and sexual orientations and abilities and races and ages and classes be included in the church on equal terms. That is non-negotiable, and there's still more. Do you remember Romans 12, where Paul writes, "Let love be genuine. Hate what is evil. Hold fast to what is good. Love one another with mutual affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. Rejoice in hope. Be patient in affliction. Persevere in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints. Pursue hospitality to strangers." These are instructions to an embattled minority community. Bless those who persecute you. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. If it is possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. For around 15 or 20 years, we've been unlearning harmful theologies, building alternative Christian community, attempting to heal from past traumas. For most of this time, we did so in an increasingly supportive national political environment. That's now over. We are now tested as we move to the next stage of our journey, which might feel a little bit like 1 Peter 3, verse 13. So striking. This is so interestingly naive sounding almost. Who will harm you if you are eager to do what is good? But even if you do suffer for doing what is right, you're blessed. Do not fear. Do not be intimidated, but in your heart sanctify Christ as Lord. Always be ready to make your defense to anyone who demands from you an accounting of the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect. Maintain a good conscience so that when you are maligned, those who abuse you for your good conduct in Christ may be put to shame. For it is better to suffer for doing good, if suffering should be God's will, than to suffer for doing evil. For Christ also suffered for sins once for all. So I offer this today because I am genuinely worried about the shadow that has now fallen across our land. And I try never to be sensationalistic, but I think we have the evidence already. We do not know when this storm will pass, but we do know who we are and whose we are, and we know what resistance looks like, and we know what community looks like, and we've been building this community for a long time, and so I believe we are ready. May it be so.